For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. David groaned as he stumbled out of the wreckage of his spacecraft, his boots crunching against the crystalline ground. The alien moon's glow bathed the desolate terrain in an eerie, iridescent light. Overhead, the shattered remains of his ship still crackled and sparked, a grim reminder of how precariously close he'd come to death. His survival instincts screamed to assess his surroundings hostile or not, but something about the air was off. It wasn't just the lack of oxygen, easily handled by his suit's filtration system. It was the weight of it, heavy with the sensation of being watched. And then, he saw her. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall and regal, her silhouette carved like a goddess against the shimmering horizon. Her skin, a radiant shade of cobalt blue, reflected the moonlight in an almost ethereal way. The braids of her dark silken hair cascaded down her back, framing her sharp cheekbones and full, commanding lips. But it was her eyes, bottomless pools of jet-black intensity, that froze him in place. "You trespass on my world, human," she said, her voice rich and resonant, carrying an authority that sent a shiver through him. David adjusted his stance, gripping the small survival blade strapped to his thigh. "Didn't have much of a choice, lady. Crash landing wasn't exactly on my itinerary." She tilted her head, amusement flickering across her otherwise stoic features. "You are bold, I'll grant you that, but boldness will not save you." Before he could reply, a sudden force seized him, yanking the knife from his hand and pinning his arms to his sides. His body was immobilized by an invisible energy, yet his mind raced as adrenaline coursed through him. He strained against the unseen bonds, his muscles flexing in futile resistance. "Let me go," he barked, glaring at her. But his captor simply stepped closer, her lips curling into a predatory smile. "You misunderstand your situation, human," she purred, stopping mere inches from him. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, intoxicating and disarming all at once. "I am Luna, queen of this world. You are mine to command." David met her gaze, defiance etched into his expression, despite his helplessness. "I don't belong to anyone." Her smile deepened, her gaze flicking over him with a mix of curiosity and something more primal. "We'll see." David's consciousness flickered in and out as he was dragged physically or mentally, he wasn't sure, into Luna's domain. When he came to, he found himself in a chamber that was more opulent than any palace he could imagine. The walls shimmered with veins of gold and silver, the floors covered in soft, exotic furs. The air was warm, thick with a faint, floral scent that seemed to cling to his skin. He was unbound, but far from free. Luna stood at the center of the room, her piercing gaze fixed on him. She had shed the heavy cape she'd worn outside, revealing a form that was both delicate and powerful. Her flawless skin seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive with energy. "Comfortable?" she asked, though there was no real concern in her tone. David pushed himself to his feet, his sharp eyes scanning for exits. "You're wasting your time if you think I'm just going to roll over and obey." Luna laughed, a low, throaty sound that sent a jolt of something unnameable through him. "You misunderstand again. Obedience isn't something I take. It's something I inspire." David's lips twitched in a half-smile. "Hate to break it to you, but I'm not the inspiring type." Her amusement faded, replaced by a smoldering intensity that made the air around them feel electric. "We'll see how long your resolve lasts." With a wave of her hand, a wave of energy rippled toward him, forcing him back onto the luxurious bedding behind him. He tensed, his every muscle coiled like a spring, but he was powerless to move as she stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "Tell me, human," she said, leaning down so that her face hovered just above his. Her breath was warm against his skin, laced with that same intoxicating floral scent. "What makes you think you can resist me?" David met her gaze, his voice steady despite the chaos raging within him. "Because I'm not afraid of you." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a crack in her icy composure. "Fear is irrelevant," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You will submit because you want to." "That's where you're wrong," David shot back, his voice firm. "I don't give in. Not to you. Not to anyone." For a long moment, they stared at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Then, to David's surprise, Luna smiled a real smile, not the predatory smirk she had worn before. "We'll see," she said softly, stepping back. "Rest, human. You'll need your strength." Over the next few days, Luna subjected David to her world's many strange and wondrous phenomena. She introduced him to her people, who regarded him with a mix of fascination and disdain. She tested him, probing his mind and body for weaknesses, yet each time he defied her, meeting her challenges with an unyielding spirit. Luna found herself torn. She was accustomed to obedience, to the awe and fear her presence inspired. But David was different. His resistance infuriated her, yet it also intrigued her. He was like a flame she couldn't extinguish, no matter how hard she tried. For David, the queen was equally maddening. She was arrogant, infuriatingly confident, yet undeniably magnetic. He hated the way his body reacted to her presence, the way her voice seemed to wrap around him like a silken thread. But he would not give her the satisfaction of breaking him. One night, as they faced off in yet another verbal sparring match, David said something that stopped her cold. "Maybe the reason you can't control me," he said, his voice low and steady, "is because you don't really want to." Her eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something behind them, something vulnerable and raw. For the first time, Luna didn't have a retort. In that moment, something shifted between them. The tension that had defined their interactions was still there, but it was no longer just a battle. It was something more, something neither of them fully understood. As Luna turned and left the room without another word, David watched her go, his heart pounding. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension, power plays, and moments that neither David nor Luna could fully explain. Every encounter between them was charged with an intensity that neither could ignore, and yet neither would dare admit what it meant. David had begun exploring the citadel under the watchful eyes of Luna's guards. She had given him limited freedom enough to observe, but not to escape. The alien fortress was a masterpiece of both engineering and artistry. Towering spires of iridescent metal pierced the alien sky, while intricate carvings told the story of Luna's reign. Despite his captivity, David couldn't help but be awed by the beauty of it all. Yet, no matter where he wandered, his thoughts always returned to her. Luna, on the other hand, found herself consumed by an unfamiliar restlessness. She sat on her throne, surrounded by advisors and warriors, but her mind was elsewhere, always drifting back to the human who had refused to kneel. She had dealt with rebels, usurpers, and even alien invaders, but none had challenged her in the way David did, and none had stirred her in the way he did. That night, as she stood on the balcony of her private chambers, staring out at the glowing plains of her world, Luna allowed herself to admit what she had been denying. She wasn't just intrigued by him, she was drawn to him. The fire in his eyes, the strength in his defiance, it was unlike anything she had ever encountered. But he was still a human, a mere outsider. She could not allow herself to be distracted by such weakness, or so she thought. The sound of the chamber doors opening startled Luna from her thoughts. She turned to find David standing in the doorway, flanked by two of her guards. He looked as defiant as ever, his dark eyes locked on hers. "You summoned me?" he asked, his tone challenging. Luna dismissed the guards with a flick of her wrist, and they retreated without a word, leaving the two of them alone. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You've been exploring my citadel," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Do you enjoy what you see?" David shrugged, his casual demeanor masking the tension in his body. "It's impressive, but I wouldn't call it home." Luna raised an eyebrow. "Do you think you'll ever return to your home, David? Your world is light years away, and your ship is beyond repair." He smirked. "Maybe not, but I'll figure something out. I always do." His confidence sent a ripple of irritation and something else through her. She stepped closer, her movements as smooth and predatory as ever. "You still don't understand, do you? You're not going anywhere. You belong to me now." David met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "You don't own me, Luna, and you never will." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she quickly composed herself, a sly smile curving her lips. "We'll see." She moved closer still, until they were only inches apart. The air between them crackled with tension, a storm of unspoken emotions. David's heart pounded, but he refused to back down, even as her presence overwhelmed his senses. "Tell me, David," she said, her voice soft and dangerous. "Why do you resist me? Is it pride, fear, or something else?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. For the first time, Luna faltered, her confidence wavering as he looked deep into her eyes. "Maybe I resist because I see something you don't want me to see," he said, his voice low and steady. "Something you're trying to hide." Her breath caught, and for a fleeting moment, vulnerability flickered across her face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a mask of cold indifference. "You know nothing of me," she said, turning away. "You're just a human. You couldn't possibly understand." David reached out, his hand brushing her arm. She froze at the contact, her body rigid with tension. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But I'm willing to try. Are you?" Luna turned to face him, her expression a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, something she couldn't name. She had always been in control, always held the upper hand. But with David, that control was slipping, and it terrified her. "You should be careful, human," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "You're playing a dangerous game." David stepped back, his gaze unwavering. "So are you." Later that night, Luna paced her chambers, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. David's words had struck a nerve, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake them. He had seen through her facade, pierced the armor she had spent a lifetime building. For the first time in her reign, Luna felt unsure of herself. Meanwhile, David sat in his chamber, staring out at the alien night. He knew he was walking a fine line with Luna, but he couldn't stop himself. There was something about her, something that drew him in despite the danger. He didn't trust her, not entirely, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt, the magnetic force that seemed to bind them together. Their next encounter would be inevitable, and when it came, neither of them would be the same. The quiet hum of the alien citadel filled the night, a rhythmic, pulsing sound that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the planet itself. David lay on the plush bedding of his chamber, his eyes staring at the carved ceiling above. Sleep eluded him. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Luna, her commanding presence, her fiery strength, and the rare, fleeting vulnerability he'd glimpsed beneath her regal facade. But it wasn't just her. It was the connection between them, the unspoken tension that defied logic. He hated how much she had invaded his thoughts, yet he couldn't stop himself from wanting to understand her. Across the fortress, Luna sat alone in her throne room, the shimmering blue light of the alien moon streaming through the high windows. She leaned back in her throne, her fingers tracing the armrest as she stared into the void. David's words echoed in her mind. "Maybe I resist because I see something you don't want me to see, something you're trying to hide." He had seen too much, he had pushed too far, and yet she couldn't bring herself to crush him as she had so many others who had dared to defy her. Why? Why did this human, with his stubborn resolve and maddening confidence, affect her so deeply? Luna clenched her fists, her frustration boiling over. She rose to her feet, her long braids swaying behind her, and stormed toward his chamber. If she couldn't silence the questions in her mind, perhaps confronting their source would. The heavy doors to David's chamber creaked open, and he sat up instantly, his senses on high alert. When he saw Luna standing in the doorway, her imposing figure framed by the dim light of the hallway, his heart skipped a beat. "Luna," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Couldn't sleep?" She stepped inside, her movements fluid and deliberate. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving them alone in the golden glow of the chamber's lamps. "Do you ever stop being insolent?" she asked, but there was no real malice in her tone. David smirked, leaning back against the wall. "Wouldn't be as much fun if I did." Luna crossed the room, her gaze never leaving his. She stopped a few paces away, her towering presence both intimidating and alluring. "You think this is a game, don't you?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can toy with me?" "I think," David replied, meeting her gaze without flinching, "that you're used to everyone doing what you say without question, and you don't know how to handle someone who doesn't." Her eyes narrowed, but there was no denying the truth in his words. "Careful, human," she warned. "You're walking a dangerous line." "Maybe," he said, his voice softening, "but so are you." For a long moment they stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. Then, to David's surprise, Luna's expression softened. The fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something he hadn't seen before, vulnerability. "You infuriate me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You challenge me in ways no one else ever has." David stood, closing the distance between them. "Maybe that's what you need," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Someone who doesn't just bow down to you. Someone who sees you for who you really are." Luna's breath hitched, and for the first time she looked uncertain. "And what do you see, David?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. He hesitated, his dark eyes searching hers. "I see someone who's stronger than anyone I've ever met," he said, his voice steady, but also someone who's afraid to let anyone see her weaknesses, someone who carries the weight of a whole world on her shoulders and doesn't trust anyone enough to share it. Luna's composure cracked, and she took a step back, as if his words had struck her physically. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Don't I?" he challenged, stepping closer. "You can keep pretending to be untouchable, Luna, but we both know that's not the whole truth." For a moment, she said nothing. Her gaze locked on his. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, she turned and stormed toward the door. "This conversation is over," she said, her voice cold and clipped. David didn't stop her. He knew he had pushed her to the edge, and he wasn't sure what would happen next. But as the doors closed behind her, he couldn't help but feel that something important had shifted between them. Luna returned to her private chambers, her heart pounding. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her mind racing. David's words had cut deeper than she cared to admit. He had seen through her, stripped away the armor she had worn for so long. She hated it. She hated him. And yet, she didn't. Luna moved to the balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She stared out at her world, the glowing plains stretching endlessly before her. For so long, she had ruled alone, unchallenged and unquestioned. But now, this human, this infuriating, stubborn, maddening human, had turned her world upside down. For the first time in her life, Luna felt something she couldn't control, something she couldn't suppress, and it terrified her. The next morning, David was awoken by the sound of his chamber doors opening. He sat up, half expecting to see Luna again, but instead, it was one of her advisors, a stern-looking alien with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. "You are summoned," the advisor said, his tone curt. David sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Let me guess your queen wants to lecture me again?" The advisor's expression didn't change. "You'll find out soon enough." As David followed the advisor through the Citadel's winding halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The atmosphere felt heavier, as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. When they entered the throne room, David's suspicions were confirmed. Luna was waiting for him, her expression unreadable. She sat on her throne, her posture as regal as ever, but there was a new intensity in her gaze, a fire that burned brighter than before. "David," she said, her voice echoing through the vast chamber, "we need to talk." Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down his spine. Whatever was about to happen, he knew it would change everything. The throne room was eerily silent as David stood before Luna, the weight of her gaze pressing down on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and David could feel the curious eyes of her advisors, who lingered at the edges of the chamber like shadows. Luna dismissed them with a wave of her hand, her voice firm and commanding. "Leave us." They obeyed without hesitation, filing out of the room until the massive doors closed behind them, leaving David and Luna alone once again. "You've summoned me," David said, breaking the silence. "What now? Another test? Another reminder that I'm yours?" Luna rose from her throne, her movements deliberate and precise. She descended the steps slowly, her presence filling the room like a storm gathering strength. When she stopped in front of him, he could see the faint glow of her cobalt skin, the way her black eyes shimmered with intensity. "I've had enough games, David," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. "Enough battles of wit, enough defiance." David raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Does that mean you're finally letting me go?" Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't the smug smirk he was used to. There was something deeper in her expression, something raw. "No," she said softly. "It means I have a proposal." David frowned, caught off guard by her words. "A proposal?" Luna stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, almost intimate tone. "You are not like anyone I have ever encountered, human. You challenge me, provoke me, and yet you intrigue me. Your defiance is maddening, but it has made me question things I have never questioned before." David tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing. "And what does that mean, exactly?" "It means," she said, her gaze locking onto his, "that I am offering you a choice." David's heart pounded as he tried to read the expression on Luna's face. For all her power and confidence, there was a vulnerability in her eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty that made her seem almost human. "You've got my attention," he said cautiously. "What's the catch?" Luna's jaw tightened, as though she were struggling to maintain her composure. "I rule this world," she began, her voice steady. "I am its queen, its protector, but I cannot deny that there is a void, a loneliness that no amount of power can fill. David blinked, stunned by her candor. "You're saying you're lonely?" Her eyes flashed, and for a moment, he thought she might lash out. But instead, she took a deep breath, regaining her poise. "I am saying," she continued, "that I do not want to rule alone, and I do not want you as a mere servant." David's mouth went dry. He wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly. "What are you saying, Luna?" "I am offering you a partnership," she said, her voice firm. "Not as equals because I am still your queen, but as something more. You would remain by my side, as my consort, my companion. You would have power, influence, freedom, but you would belong to me." David stared at her, his mind reeling. The idea of staying on this alien moon, of being tied to her in such an intimate way, was overwhelming. But what shocked him even more was the part of him that wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. "And if I say no?" he asked, his voice quiet. Luna's expression darkened, but there was no anger in her voice when she replied, "If you say no, I will let you leave the Citadel. You can roam my world freely, but you will never leave it. Your ship is beyond repair, and there is no other way off this moon. You would live out your days alone, a stranger in a strange land." David let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "So it's stay with you or live in exile. Hell of a choice. It is more generous than most would offer," she said, her tone clipped. "Do not mistake my leniency for weakness." David met her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers. "Why me?" he asked. "Out of all the beings in this galaxy, why would you want me?" Luna hesitated, and for the first time she looked away. "Because you see me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just the queen, not just the power. You see the person beneath it all. And She trailed off, her words hanging in the air. David's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to be so honest, so vulnerable. It made him see her in a new light, not just as a ruler or a captor, but as someone who had been alone for far too long. David paced the chamber later that night, Luna's proposal replaying in his mind. He was torn between his instinct to resist and the undeniable connection he felt to her. She infuriated him, challenged him, but she also fascinated him in a way he couldn't explain. Could he really stay here? Could he really give up his dreams of returning to Earth, of living a normal life? And yet, what was left for him on Earth? He had no family, no ties, nothing to return to. Out here, he had found something unexpected, someone unexpected. When the doors to his chamber opened and Luna stepped inside, he wasn't surprised. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Well?" she finally asked, her voice calm, but laced with tension. "Have you made your decision?" David took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "You're asking me to give up everything," he said, "to stay here, with you." Luna nodded. "Yes. And if I stay, I'm supposed to trust you, to believe that this is more than just another power play?" Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she let her walls crumble completely. "If you stay," she said quietly, "I will give you more than power or freedom. I will give you the truth." David studied her, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, he made his choice. "I'll stay," he said, his voice steady. "But if this is going to work, Luna, you have to meet me halfway. No more games, no more lies." A faint smile touched her lips, and for the first time, David saw something in her that he hadn't seen before. Hope. "Agreed," she said. As they stood there, the tension between them shifting into something new, David couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right decision. But one thing was certain, his life would never be the same. The days following David's decision were unlike anything he had experienced before. His place in the Citadel had changed, but so had his relationship with Luna. The fiery battles of will between them now gave way to something more nuanced, a partnership forged from tension, respect, and an undercurrent of emotions neither could fully articulate. Yet being Luna's consort was not a passive role. She tested him constantly, dragging him into the affairs of her rule, exposing him to the complexities of her world. He was not a decoration to be paraded around. She demanded his insights, his strength, and his unfiltered honesty. The Queen's court, however, was less welcoming. Her advisors whispered about the human interloper, their disdain thinly veiled. One alien noble, a towering male named Kale, confronted Luna in front of the entire council. "This is madness, my queen," Kale declared, his blue skin glinting under the chamber's light. You elevate a human, an outsider, to stand beside you. It is an insult to our people." David stood at Luna's side, his jaw clenched, but before he could speak, Luna silenced Kale with a single, sharp glare. "You dare question me?" she said, her voice cold and deadly. "This human has proven himself in ways you could never comprehend. His defiance, his strength, these are qualities I value, qualities that make him worthy of standing at my side." Kale's lips curled into a sneer. "Strength? He is a weak creature, bound by mortality, and..." Before Kale could finish, Luna raised her hand, and a pulse of energy erupted from her palm, sending the noble sprawling to the floor. The room fell silent, all eyes on their queen. "I will not tolerate insubordination," Luna said, her voice like steel. "David is under my protection. Question him again, and you question me." David's chest tightened as he watched her defend him. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he chose to stay, but seeing Luna wield her power on his behalf stirred something deep within him. That night, David found Luna on the balcony of her private chambers, the alien moon casting a soft glow over her cobalt skin. She stood with her back to him, her long braids swaying in the cool breeze. "You didn't have to do that," he said, stepping closer. "I can handle myself." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I know you can, but they needed to understand that you are more than just a human to me." David leaned against the balcony's railing, his dark eyes studying her. "And what am I to you, Luna?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For once, Luna didn't have a ready answer. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You are an enigma," she said finally. "You challenge me in ways no one else dares to. You see through me, past the walls I've built. It's unsettling." David chuckled softly. "Glad to know I keep you on your toes." She shot him a look, but there was no malice in it, only a flicker of something softer. "You infuriate me, David, but you also intrigue me, and that is not something I can ignore." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You know, for someone who claims to be all-powerful, you're terrible at admitting what you really feel." Luna's eyes flashed, but instead of retaliating, she surprised him. "And you, for all your bravado, are afraid to admit that you feel the same." David froze, caught off guard by her words. He opened his mouth to respond, but she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Her presence was overwhelming, her scent intoxicating. "You chose to stay," she said, her voice a whisper. "You could have walked away, but you didn't." He swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "Maybe I didn't want to." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment, the unspoken tension between them threatened to consume them both. But then she stepped back, breaking the spell. "Rest, human," she said, her tone shifting back to its usual coolness. "Tomorrow, your training begins." David blinked. "Training?" "If you are to stand at my side," she said, her voice firm, "you must prove yourself not just to me, but to my people. Strength alone will not suffice. You must learn to wield power, to command respect." David smirked, his confidence returning. "Bring it on." The next day, Luna led David to the Citadel's training grounds, a vast expanse of alien terrain filled with strange, glowing structures and advanced technology. She stood at the edge of the field, her arms crossed as she addressed him. "You will face 3 trials," she said, "each designed to test your mind, body, and spirit. Only by succeeding in all 3 will you earn your place." David nodded, his determination unwavering. "What's the first trial?" Luna gestured toward a towering structure in the distance, its surface shimmering with an eerie blue light. "The trial of endurance. You must reach the top of that tower and retrieve the orb at its peak. The path is treacherous, and the tower itself will resist you." David grinned. "Sounds like fun." Luna's lips twitched, as though she were fighting a smile. "We'll see how much fun you're having when you're halfway up." The trial was grueling. The tower's surface shifted beneath his hands, its alien material pulsing with energy that threatened to knock him off at every turn. He climbed with grit and determination, his muscles burning as he pushed himself to his limits. Below, Luna watched, her expression impassive, but her eyes filled with something akin to pride. When David finally reached the top and held the orb aloft, a triumphant shout escaped his lips. Luna allowed herself a small smile as he descended, his body covered in sweat, but his spirit unbroken. "Not bad," she said when he reached her, "but the next trial will not be so easy." David smirked, handing her the orb. "I wouldn't want it to be." As the days passed and David continued to face Luna's trials, their relationship deepened in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The tension between them remained, but it was no longer a battle of dominance. It was a dance, a fragile balance of power and vulnerability that bound them together. Luna found herself drawn to his strength, his resilience, and the way he challenged her in ways no one else could. And David, despite his initial resistance, couldn't deny the magnetic pull he felt toward her. But even as their bond grew, shadows loomed on the horizon. Rumors of rebellion stirred within the Citadel, whispers of dissent among Luna's people who questioned her decision to elevate a human. And somewhere in the depths of the alien moon, an ancient threat stirred, its presence a reminder that their fragile alliance would soon be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. For now, though, they stood together, two unlikely souls, bound by fire and fate, ready to face whatever came next. The night before the final trial, the air in the Citadel was thick with tension. David stood on the balcony of his chamber, staring out at the glowing plains that stretched endlessly beyond the fortress walls. He could feel the weight of what was coming, the sense that everything he had endured since crashing on this moon was building towards something monumental. Behind him, the door creaked open, and he didn't need to turn to know it was Luna. Her presence was as familiar to him now as his own shadow. "Tomorrow is the final trial," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The trial of the soul." David turned to face her, his dark eyes meeting her liquid black gaze. "Sounds dramatic," he said, his tone light despite the tension in his chest. "It is," Luna replied, stepping closer. "It is a trial that will strip you bare, force you to confront the deepest parts of yourself. It is not a test of strength or intellect, but of truth." David frowned. "And what truth am I supposed to find?" "That," Luna said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is for you to discover." She hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. "There is something you must know, David. If you fail this trial, it will not only cost you your place at my side, it will cost you your life." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. No pressure then. Luna's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You've surprised me before, human. Perhaps you will again." The next morning, Luna led David to the heart of the Citadel, a vast, circular chamber carved into the depths of the fortress. The walls pulsed with a soft golden light, and at the center of the room was a pool of shimmering liquid that seemed to defy gravity, its surface rippling upward like a living thing. "This is the soul well," Luna said, gesturing toward the pool. "It will reveal your truest self, your fears, your desires, your failures. You must face whatever it shows you, without running, without denying." David stared at the glowing pool, his heart pounding. "And if I don't, it will consume you," Luna said simply. David took a deep breath, his fists clenching at his sides. "Great. Let's get this over with." He stepped toward the soul well, its light intensifying as he approached. When he reached the edge, he glanced back at Luna one last time. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, concern. Before he could dwell on it, the soul well surged upward, its liquid tendrils wrapping around him and pulling him in. The world dissolved into blinding light, and then darkness. David found himself standing in a void, surrounded by fragments of memories, his childhood, his time on Earth, the crash that had brought him to Luna's world. Each memory played out like a hologram, vivid and hauntingly real. But the visions didn't stop there. They shifted, morphing into scenes he didn't recognize, visions of Luna, standing alone in her throne room, her face etched with sorrow. Visions of her people turning against her, of battles fought and lives lost. And then a vision of himself, standing at her side, his hand clasping hers as they faced an unseen enemy together. "You see it now," a voice echoed around him. It was Luna's voice, but deeper, more resonant. "The truth you have denied." David turned, searching for the source of the voice. "What truth?" "That you are not here by chance," the voice said. "That you are bound to her, as she is bound to you. Two flames, destined to burn brighter together, or to destroy one another." The visions shifted again, and David saw his own face, twisted in rage and pain. He saw himself standing over Luna's broken body, her black eyes staring lifelessly at the sky. The sight tore through him, and he fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," he whispered. "That's not going to happen." The voice softened. "That is for you to decide, David. Will you stand by her, or will you be the one who breaks her? David clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He thought of everything he had endured, everything he had fought for. He thought of Luna, her strength, her fire, her vulnerability. And he knew his answer. I won't let that happen, he said, rising to his feet. I'll protect her. I'll stand with her, no matter what. The darkness shattered, and the light of the soul well engulfed him. When David emerged from the soul well, he was shaking, his body drenched in sweat. Luna stood waiting for him, her expression unreadable as she studied his face. Well, she asked, her voice steady, did you find your truth? David met her gaze, his dark eyes blazing with determination. I did, and it's you, Luna. It's us. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she looked almost vulnerable. But then she stepped closer, her composure returning. And what will you do with that truth, human? David smiled faintly. Whatever it takes to keep you safe, to keep us both standing. Luna's lips parted, as if she were about to say something, but instead, she reached out, placing a hand on his chest. You have passed the trial, she said softly. You are no longer just a human, David. You are mine, and I am yours. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, the bond between them solidifying in a way that defied explanation. For the first time, David felt truly connected to this strange world and to the queen who ruled it. But their moment of peace was short-lived. The whispers of rebellion within the citadel erupted into full-blown chaos as Kale and his followers launched an attack, their forces storming the throne room in a bid to overthrow Luna. David and Luna fought side by side, their movements perfectly synchronized as they faced the onslaught. She wielded her powers with devastating precision, while David used his cunning and resourcefulness to outmaneuver their enemies. At the height of the battle, Kale confronted them, his eyes blazing with hatred. You have betrayed your people, my queen, he spat. For what? A human. You are unfit to rule. Luna's expression hardened, and she stepped forward, her voice ringing out like thunder. You dare challenge me, Kale. I am not just a queen, I am a force you cannot hope to contain. As Kale lunged at her, David intercepted him, their clash fierce and brutal. In the end, it was Luna who struck the final blow, her energy ripping through Kale's body and ending the rebellion once and for all. When the battle was over, the citadel was eerily quiet. Luna stood at the center of the throne room, her head held high despite the exhaustion etched into her features. David stood beside her, his presence steady and unshakable. You've proven yourself, she said, turning to him. Not just to me, but to my people. You are no longer an outsider, David. You are part of this world now. David smiled, his dark eyes meeting hers. And you're not alone anymore, Luna. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Luna allowed herself to smile a real, genuine smile. Together, they would rebuild, forging a new future for her people. A future built on trust, on strength, and on the unbreakable bond between a human and an alien queen.